Yes, we're recording. Moshe, you can begin.
Okay, thank you, John. Let me just hit this button. Okay. Shalom, everybody. On behalf of the Adult Education Committee of the Jewish Center, I would like to welcome you to tonight's program on the origin and tradition history of Passover and Matsot. It is part of the Jewish Center's array of special programming for Pesach. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Alan Cooper was on the team that welcomed me to the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2012. As the provost, he was responsible for the academic supervision of the context program. He always provided me with wise counsel, not only on academic matters, but also on how to navigate the complex and sometimes baffling institution. Alan Cooper is the Elaine Ravitch Professor of Jewish Studies. He joined the faculty in 1997 as a professor of Bible. In 1998, he was appointed professor of Bible at the Union Theological Seminary, a non-denominational Christian seminary, becoming the first person to hold concurrent professorships at JTS and at Union. Previously, he was professor of Bible at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where for 6 years he was the director of its School for Graduate Studies. He also taught religious studies for a decade at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Dr. Cooper earned a bachelor's degree in religion at Columbia University. He went on to do his graduate work at Yale University, earning a Master of Philosophy degree and a doctorate in religious studies. He also spent a year at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as a postdoc fellow. Alan is widely published and his research interests are varied. Alan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Moshe, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I also would like to thank you and the members of the Adult Education Committee for so graciously inviting me to learn with you this evening. I'd like to begin with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Even amidst these very difficult times in which we find ourselves, it's a privilege and an honor as well as an obligation for us to continue and engage in the study and contemplation of Torah. Well, with Passover and Matsot, notice I referred to it as two separate holidays looming, I thought it might be interesting and enjoyable to talk about how we got from there to here. That is to say, how the present understanding of this great spring festival of the Jewish religion developed from its origins in biblical Israel and perhaps even prior to that. So I'd like to make a couple of preliminary statements just so that you'll know the kind of approach that I'll be taking with you this evening, and I hope that there'll be ample time for us to engage in discussion and for you to raise questions, because a lot of what I'm going to say, of course, is going to be dubious. So that's typical of biblical scholarship. The first thing that should be obvious to everyone is that the calendar that we observe as Jews is a composite. That is to say that it reflects festivals and occasions and observances and elements of worship that come from different times and places, that have different origins, and that have all come together in the entity that we observe. You can see this very clearly, for example, in the fall, where we seem to have an endless stream of holidays that are only tenuously related to one another. So the 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur seem to inaugurate a fall New Year season. And then the period from Sukkot to Shemini Atzeret seems to introduce a new fall, a fall New Year season. Well, what do you know? So we have two overlapping New Year seasons, one of which comprises Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the other of which comprises Sukkot and Shemini Atzeret, overlaid one upon the other, and then arrayed in sequence rather than simultaneous, which is very confusing. The Bible is very straightforward about the combination of Pesach, Passover, and Matsot, unleavened bread, because of the way it lays out that combination in Exodus chapters 12 and 13, which we'll be taking a close look at this evening. And there are many other instances that, if you stop and think about it, you'll realize that you have a kind of palimpsest in biblical literature and in rabbinic literature and following, in which you have layer upon layer of transformations, reinterpretations, and developments of old festivals laid one upon the other until we get where we are now. So as a clear example, for example, Shabbat, the Sabbath, which begins as a quotidian day off for farm labor. It's simply a bit of social legislation that requires us to allow both our laborers and our animals, our domesticated animals, to have a day off, which is just good common sense, good animal husbandry and decent treatment of labor. So how does it become a communal religious occasion when there's a public gathering and when in biblical times special sacrifices were offered? Well, because of a process of development and reinterpretation that takes place in different times and places over a period of centuries till we get where we are now. That's point number one, that our calendar is composite of diverse origins in terms of both content and in terms of geography and in terms of substance. And the second thing that I want to say is that the festivals all coalesce around what I like to refer to as two foundation myths that define us as Jews and define our Jewish identity, and that inform essentially every aspect of biblical literature and underlie all of Jewish thought. One of these is the creation of the world, so that the dogmatic belief in God as the creator, God who was responsible for the existence of everything, and the additional notion that arises in rabbinic literature that God created the world with a special intention of creating it for the Jewish people and in order to establish the Torah in the world as the constitution of the Jewish people. That's one of our primary myths, one of the things that define us as human beings and as Jews. The second, of course, which brings us more directly to Pesach and Matsot, is the Exodus from Egypt. So whereas you might say that the creation of the world is a universal human myth, the Exodus is specifically Jewish, the way in which the period of enslavement, followed by liberation, followed by the yoking of the Jewish people, specially elected by God to be in a special relationship to God, defined by observance of the commandments, is definitive of Jewish identity. So what do you expect to happen to the festivals? The centripetal force of the two foundation myths that define us as human beings and as Jews will naturally shape the way in which we reinterpret the festivals. And you can see this very clearly. So that Shabbat, which is, as I said, initially just a bit of social legislation that makes good sense for care of farm labor and farm animals, comes to be the commemoration of God's creation of the world based on a story that has God creating, acting for 6 days and resting on the seventh, which provides the origin story, the etiology for our observance of that seventh day of rest. So it embeds the origin of Shabbat in the creation of the world. And the same thing is true for the three great pilgrimage festivals. We'll talk more about the origin of Passover and unleavened bread, but it should be obvious without my saying anything more that Passover featuring the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb is predominantly a pastoral festival, a festival for shepherds, and that Matsot, which involves the consumption of unleavened bread, is primarily agrarian. That is to say, people who are agricultural people would be associated with unleavened bread and the removal of leaven from their precincts, which are the primary edicts associated with the festival of unleavened bread. So, in other words, they can have perfectly ordinary origins in life on the land, whether it be the life of shepherds or the life of farmers, and yet somehow they become linked inextricably with the Exodus. The same thing obviously is true for Sukkot, right? Which is Thanksgiving, the harvest festival. So what does it have to do with the booths that the Israelites allegedly dwelt in the wilderness? That's in broadest terms, part of the centripetal force of the foundation myths, drawing the old festivals, whatever their original purpose might have been, into commemorations of these fundamental foundational events, the creation of the world and the Exodus. The same thing is true for Shavuot. And what's remarkable about Shavuot, which we call Zman Matan Toratenu, which commemorates the giving of the Torah, the giving of the law, is that the association of Shavuot with the Exodus, with the central event of the Exodus experience, which is the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that's a post-biblical development. But it shows that even after the completion of the biblical canon, the force of these fundamental stories, creation and Exodus, continues to shape the way we define Jewish identity, reinterpret our festivals, and observe them. Of course, within the Bible itself, you find the blending of the two myths, creation and Exodus, such that the Exodus comes to be regarded as a creative event. Look at the Hallel Psalm, Psalm 114, for an instance of that. And the Exodus becomes a type for events outside the Exodus from Egypt, specifically the return of the exiles from Babylonia to the land of Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, which is a new Exodus, which is a new creation, a new thing. That's exactly what Isaiah calls it. And it then creates a type or a model for other liberating acts of God that people in all the Western faiths associate with the original Exodus that we're going to be talking about in a moment. So those are a couple of general statements. There's the assimilation of the calendar and the calendrical occasions to the two great foundation myths, and the creation of the calendar as a composite filled with material of diverse origins that's all reinterpreted in the light of the shaping of Jewish identity throughout the biblical and early post-biblical periods. Questions or comments about those general statements before we go directly into the text of Exodus 12 and 13?
I don't have any.
Okay, not yet. So good. So then with your permission, I'd like to share a screen and we'll start looking at some text.
Professor Cooper, may I just make a statement that I agree with you that the Exodus from Egypt is a Jewish phenomenon, and that it defines the Jewish people. But I also believe that it is, even though the Jewish people, the Israelites, were chosen for this, they represent all of humanity, and they are a chosen people, but they represent all of humanity.
May I respectfully request that questions and comments be directed to Moshe in the chat so that we can conduct them in an organized way.
Okay.
What you have just done is addressed. One is a central problem for biblical theology, which is precisely the question of the universalization of the Exodus. And that is specifically associated with a phenomenon in Christian theology, originally Catholic, but then much more widespread than that, that's known as liberation theology. The idea that God is the universal liberator and that the Exodus from Egypt, far from being a specifically Jewish event, is in fact a model or type of divine behavior, of God's intention for all people in the world. That is to say, everyone is enslaved somehow, somewhere, in some manner, whether it be literal or figurative, to something. And the divine task is the task of seeking liberation for all those who were enslaved. The problem with that, which was pointed out in a famous essay by John Levinson, teaches at the Harvard Divinity School, is that requires the separation of the liberating portion of the Exodus from the covenantal portion of the Exodus, which is to say that you basically stop the story at Exodus 15 with the celebration of the victory over the Egyptians at the sea. But that's only preliminary in the biblical account to the yoking of the Israelites to covenant and law. And it's not just any old law, it's the specifics of Jewish law. So in other words, you want to have it both ways. You want to be able to say that the Exodus is a specifically Jewish occasion when you think of the Exodus as entailing the giving of the law at Sinai and the yoking of Israel to obedience to the covenant at Sinai. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to break the whole Exodus narrative into its component parts, so that the only thing that matters from a universal point of view is not the election or the special mission of the Jewish people, but the fact that God wants to liberate all of humankind, that no one ever should be enslaved. You can have it both ways, of course, but I hope you understand that they represent two different alternatives in the interpretation of the narrative portions of the story. So that's a very important question that you raise, and it's one that we could spend our whole hour and a half on, but I think we'll instead look at text. Anything else? Moshe, do you have anything else?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Okay, why have the Ashkenazi rabbis distanced us so far from the Paschal festive post-destruction of the temple? E.g., we don't eat lamb. We really have mostly a matzah festival now.
A matzah festival?
That's what it says.
First of all, you're right. Ashkenazim don't eat lamb. And that's a matter of custom, not a matter of halacha. It's not a legal matter. And it probably has to do with the Jewish-Christian engagement because of the identification of Jesus as the Lamb of God. So let's just set that question aside. Because after all, as I think the question implied correctly, other Jewish streams, other Zeramim, do consume lamb on Passover. And of course, then there's another tendency that has nothing to do with this particular question, and that's the question of whether you make any reference to meat at all, or whether you use some kind of symbolic surrogate for the sacrificial meat of the Paschal lamb, as we do on our table. The most common substitutes being a block of wood that signifies the wood that would have burned for the sacrificial fire, or a beet. We use a beet because the red color of the beet symbolizes the sacrificial blood without actually being meat. Again, I mean, these are excellent questions, but they would lead us rather far afield from looking at the history of the festivals, I'm afraid. So with your permission, I'm going to turn to that. And what I want to do is I want to parse the text of Exodus 12 and 13 so that we see first the primary texts that define the observances associated with Pesach and Matsot, disconnected from any particular association with the Exodus, then we'll see how the biblical authors make the connection between law and history, which happens to be unique in ancient Near Eastern legislation. That is to say, to ground law in narrative, or to explain the observance of, or the innovation of, or the reinterpretation of law in terms of a story, is absolutely uncharacteristic of ancient Near Eastern legislation, which tells its stories as one genre of literature and which recounts its laws or reports its laws in other genres. And laws are divided into cultic laws and civil laws and criminal laws, and they're rarely combined in single texts. But the Bible is a mishmash of different types of laws, and most remarkably, in the conflation of law with narrative and in the use of narrative to explain law. And we see that beautifully in Exodus 12 and 13. So first we'll talk about the core observances, and the reason things are in different colors because I love to play with colors on my word processor, but also because I want to be able to illustrate in the text itself how these different components are put together. Then question number one, what might Pesach and Matsot have meant prior to their being adapted to commemorate the Exodus? I already talked briefly about the pastoral origin of Pesach and the agricultural, agrarian origin of Matsot. What can we learn from the core observances? In other words, can we figure something out about their pre-Exodus life, as it were, in the lives of the Israelite people from the core observances? Then how are the core observances linked to the historical narrative? Then how do we take these two stories and these two sets of observances and join them into one, so that this thing we call Passover is really the combination of two originally distinct festivals that reflect two different cultural origins? And how then finally the third piece in Exodus 12 and 13 is how are the festivals related to the dedication or redemption of the firstborn, which is a component that's added from out of left field to the core pastoral and agricultural observances, although one can readily think of the association of first things, whether it be bikurim, first fruits, or firstborn animals being dedicated to God, dedicated to the priests, dedicated to the sanctuary, as having this association with the plague of the firstborn that joins the narrative to the laws in the first place. And then my final question is, why is there so much emphasis on propadeutic, that is to say on elementary education in the Exodus story, which we'll see obsessively, repeatedly? I'm going to just say right off the top of my head, and you can agree or disagree based on what we read together, that part of the reason for the propadeutic is because of reinterpretation. In other words, why is somebody going to come along and ask, well, why are you slaughtering that lamb? If slaughtering a lamb was simply a commonplace activity on the part of shepherds. So why are you slaughtering that lamb? Because I have a new explanation for it that you've never heard before. And let me tell you a story about where that really comes from. Not from everyday flock practice, but from this grand story of Israelite origins. And the requirement of perpetual observance, which is strongly emphasized because, of course, the way the observances are situated in the narrative might mislead you to think that these are one-time events that do not have to be repeated, do not have to recur again and again and again in order to serve as the principal commemorations of the events that are narrated. So we begin with what I take, and I'm not going to, advance the argument for this now, but what I take to be the earliest text, earliest component of the composite Exodus 12 and 13, which is here in Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 to 27. And I've just made a jumble of the text based on my historical analysis of it. If we had a whole semester together, obviously I would have to argue for that and we would go back and forth about what the evidence for picking these particular pieces out would be and how we put them in this particular order. So first we have the integration of the law into the narrative by means of this introductory statement in verse 21. Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, and that's like all these, laws that we have, all the ritual laws in Leviticus, for example, where you have descriptive laws about how to perform a sacrifice, and they're introduced with a statement like, God called to Moses and God said to Moses, say unto the people Israel, or say unto Aaron, and then comes a law that has absolutely nothing to do with the narrative. In other words, the descriptive portion of the law has been made prescriptive by its being associated with the lawgivers, God, and God's agent, who is Moses. That's part of transforming law into narrative and integrating the two, which, as I say, is a distinctive feature of biblical literature. So go pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. And that's this word, shahatu hapasach. That's the pausal form for Pesach. And the footnote says, possibly protective offering. And in verse 23, Pasach, you probably learned the name of the holiday as Passover because of the alleged interpretation of verse 23 that says that the Lord will pass over the door, which is almost certainly wrong. But it doesn't make any difference.
What?
Are you still listening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please mute yourselves when you're not actually speaking. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a moment. Yes, so the protective offering, and already in rabbinic literature, you can see here in the Mechilta, the early rabbinic commentary on Exodus, Ein Pesicha ela chayas. Pesicha means protection, or concern, or care. There are a lot of different ways to explain the word, but that's almost certainly correct. Passover, to explain the word Pasach as Passover, is already capitulating to the association of the law with the narrative. You understand? So that instead of giving it its basic meaning, which has to do with protection of the flock, and then you get this strange blood smearing ritual. It's a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, apply some of the blood that's in the basin to the lintel and to the two doorposts. This is obviously what we call an apotropaic ritual. That's to say, a magically protective ritual that is designed to protect the family and the flock at the critical moment of what's called in pastoral thought, transhumance. That is to say, the times at which the flocks are bearing and it's time to move them from one pasturage to another, and they have to be culled so that they remain healthy. So the culling is ritually signified by the slaughter of the redundant animals and also the blood smearing rite that is of a protective character, and then the confining of the clan or the family to the house until morning. There's nothing to do with Exodus here. There's everything to do with magical rites that are designed to protect the family of shepherds and their flock from the potential of destruction that could ensue at critical times of birthing and movement of the flocks. Immediately, we are given an historical motive. When the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. Now, if I left out this first part of verse 23 and simply said, when the Lord passes over your door, the Lord will not let the destroyer, how do you like that term for a kind of agent of divine destruction, whether that is supposed to be a metaphor for God, God's self, who acts in a destructive capacity, or some kind of third party acting as a divine agent, this too represents a really early and really ancient notion about the danger that confronts the flocks at certain critical times in the pastoral life. So God takes the blood smearing rite, which is a protective rite, as an occasion not to allow the destroyer to afflict that particular home. And that is then in turn linked, that law is linked specifically to the plague against the firstborn. When the Lord goes to smite the Egyptians, no specific mention of firstborn there, he'll see the blood and pass over the door. We don't feel real comfortable with the idea that God responds to magical rituals, so that we can coerce God to behave in a certain way by engaging in rituals of magic. But that's exactly what we have in the background of this pastoral rite. Then we're told, observe it as an institution for all time. So we have the core observance. We have an historical motive that's assigned to it that's clearly secondary. We have the insistence that even though this is linked to a particular historical event, it represents a perpetual observance. And then finally, stage 4, what on earth have I done in redefining, redrawing, re-explaining the law this way? When you enter the land, you shall observe this rite, which makes no sense, because this is for the time of transition, not for the time of settlement. But of course, it also represents the reinterpretation of a rite that shepherds have been practicing for who knows how long. When your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? This is so embedded in the whole concept of the Passover Seder. But what's more important is that it actually represents what is essentially a motive for the giving of Torah itself, which is the idea that we have sets of values, sets of observances, sets of beliefs that we think are so essential to our identity that we provide instructions to transmit them from one generation to the next. That transgenerational transmission of core values is an essential Torah idea that's embodied here in these instructions with respect to the propedeutic, with respect to explaining the meaning and significance and importance of core rituals to our children. You shall say, Zevach Pesach hu l'Adonai. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, Asher Pasach al Batei B'nai Israel, and there's the traditional translation, passed over the houses of the Israelites when he smote the Egyptians, but I would say protected the Israelites, miraculously protected us in relation to the success of the magical ritual that we performed as part of our Pesach observance. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, having described what I think are the 4 components of the core observance of Pesach. The Paschal Lamb, the association of it with the Exodus experience, the instruction that this is not merely a one-time observance, but one to be undertaken in perpetuity, and perhaps most important of all, the propedeutic, the transgenerational transmission of the core values and the historical identification that are associated with this particular ritual. There's nothing there at all about unleavened bread or about seders or about the stuff that we do now in relation to Passover, but this represents part of its earliest core. Moshe, anything up?
Yes.
Please.
What is the connection in Hebrew between Pesach and Passover? From what I can tell, the word Pesach is used in both instances.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the thrust of the question is, but I thought I just said that that I think that Pesach as Passover is a secondary reinterpretation in the light of the narrative and not the primary meaning of the term. Pesach there have been a lot of attempts to explain it historically, but even going back to the rabbis, the association of Pesach with protection, and that protection in turn with this apotropaic protective rite that entails the slaughter of the lamb and the smearing of its blood on the doorposts of the house, that's been recognized as a fundamental aspect of the Passover or Pesach ritual. Another word in Hebrew, Piseach. Some of you may be familiar with that word. That means lame, L-A-M-E. And since we know so little about things like the choreography of observance, it was suggested a long time ago that the word actually has to do with some kind of dance that people did in conjunction with the pastoral rites that may have looked to outsiders like it was a kind of irregular meter or a limping dance, something like that. And moving back and forth, perhaps with a limping motion. I don't place much stock in that, but I do place a lot of stock in the protection image as primary, the passing over image as an expansion of the protection image and an elaboration of it based on an assimilation to the narrative. And there are lots of cases of that in the Bible, of expanding the meaning of terms based on association with other terms or to assimilate them to stories. Anything else?
Not at this point.
Okay. So then part 2, Matsot, which is the term for unleavened bread. This time we start with the etiology or motive. In other words, we start before we even have any description of core observance. We have one of the most important words in the Jewish vocabulary, which is Zachor. It's the title of Professor Yerushalmi's wonderful book about Jewish history, and it represents one of the fundamental moves in the Jewish identity, in defining Jewish identity, which is the expansion of the concept of memory well beyond the memory of people who are actual participants in the events that they're remembering, to the notion that the historical memory has to be renewed from generation to generation, as we say in the Passover Seder, ki'ilu, as if we were there. In other words, we have to reenact in our minds and hearts the experience of the Exodus by the act of memory instead of the act of actual participation, and that is signified by the commandment to remember. Just as we remember Zachoret Yom HaShabbat L'Kadasho, we remember the Sabbath day in order to sanctify it. Anybody in the room there at the time that the world was created? I doubt it. But we act as if we were, in a kind of mythic, fictive, mystical act of identification and memory in order to associate ourselves ever more intimately with these core beliefs. And this ties back to the first question that we had, how God, as liberator, Hotzi Adonai etchem mizeh, how the Lord freed you from it with a mighty hand, no leavened bread shall be eaten. Okay, so the commemoration entails lo yeyachel chametz, no leaven can be consumed. You go free on this day in the month of Aviv, which is not a month in the Jewish calendar that we have now. So when the Lord has brought you into the land of Canaan, when you enter the land, which is what we read about the Passover, you shall observe in this month the following practice. Now, as in the case of the blood smearing ritual of the Paschal lamb, we have the core instruction that has absolutely nothing to do with the Exodus. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. On the 7th day, there shall be a festival of the Lord. Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. I don't see anything at all, by the way, about the first 2 days of Passover being any kind of a special occasion. I only see the end of the festival as marked as a special occasion. Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leaven shall be found with you. No leaven shall be found in all your territory. Now, what's leaven all about? What's leaven all about? Well, for people engaged in agriculture, leaven signifies corruption and rot. I mean, you can't get bread without leaven, but as soon as you introduce leaven into grain, what happens is that it starts to ferment. And that's good for some purposes, but basically it means that it's going to rot, it's going to deteriorate, it's going to die. So leaven is a signifier of death, and death has to be removed from our premises, from our precincts, in order to ensure the continuation of a successful harvest and successful agricultural life, just as the flocks have to be culled in order for us to ensure the continuing fecundity of the flocks and the livelihood of the shepherds who tend them. So what we have in these spring festivals are magical rites that are intended to ensure the continuing success of the tending of the flocks and the continuing success of our agricultural activities. But when you think about these concepts metaphorically, of course, we become the flock tended by the divine shepherd, subject to destruction by the Egyptians and their army. And we are the ones who require the protection of the shepherd, who, in observing our blood right, protects us. And the same thing is true here. By removing death from our premises, we prevent destruction from ensuing. And of course, it has to do both with the destruction of our harvest, with our agricultural activities, but also with the people, with us, the people who would be subject to destruction as well. And now you got to explain this. In other words, this agricultural right that's designed to ensure the successful harvest, which is not going to happen for some time. Remember, we're well short of harvest time, as we read in the later sources about the counting of the Omer until we're ready to harvest the winter wheat and bring the Bikurim to the festival. So this isn't a harvest festival. This is a time that's fraught with uncertainty, when we don't know whether the harvest is going to be successful when it comes to pass 7 weeks or 8 weeks from now, or whenever exactly it will be. You shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. So just as we liberate our precincts from leaven, with a source, which is a source of corruption and rot and death, so God has removed us from a place of corruption and death by taking us out of Egypt. And you can see the metaphorical association then of the elimination of death from our precincts, from our community, even if it's fictive, even if it's just ritualized, even if it's only temporary, as joining the original agricultural significance of the festival with its historical import. And this shall serve you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, which is fascinating, because that raises another interesting tension that we have within the history of reception of biblical literature, whether this is supposed to be understood as a metaphor or as literally related to the scrolls that we place in the tefillin that we wear during our prayers. And I won't go into that, but the idea that the sign or the reminder should be either in our hearts and in our minds, or should be literally on our bodies, is a question. That the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth. Torah Adonai b'ficha, ki biyad chazakah hutziacha Adonai miMitzrayim. And then finally, we know we're going to get part 4 in the core observance, the basic observance, removing all leaven, the instruction to observe it in perpetuity, which comes at the end, the historicization or explanation of the agrarian right in terms of the Exodus from Egypt, and then finally the propaedeutic. It's not finally, but the propaedeutic. And again, my view, which you may or may not share, is that you need the propaedeutic because you are imbuing an old observance with completely new meaning. And that new meaning is what has to be taught from generation to generation. And it's absolutely crucial because it's definitive of our commemoration of the event that defines us as Jews. So that's the core of Matsot, or unleavened bread. And you can see from just looking at the two excerpts that we looked at, that even within the Bible as we possess it, there are separate explanations of the two components of what we call Passover that have nothing to do with one another. That is to say, the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb on the one hand, and the prevention of any consumption of leaven in our precincts, which is on the other hand. Questions, comments? You got anything, Moshe?
Yes.
Okay, please.
I know that you gave a few, but the person asked, are there other instructions that are given to us to be specifically followed in perpetuity? Now, I know
Oh,
you
yes.
started, but can you give some more examples, please?
I'd rather not do it off the top of my head, but if you just go to a concordance, you can find Chukato Olam L'Dorotechem connected with many observances and obligations, that these are eternal edicts that are intended to be preserved in perpetuity. Why specifically in relation to Pesach and Matzot? I think because of a distinction that the rabbis are already familiar with, which is the distinction between the specific observances that happen at the moment of the Exodus according to the narrative, and the changes that will necessarily ensue when we enter the land and we're observing it and we're not actually at the moment of being literally liberated in this historical way. And they call one Pesach Mitzrayim, the Passover observed in Egypt, and Pesach Hadorot or Ladorot, which is the Pesach that's to be observed in perpetuity. So once we have the Pesach that is to be observed in perpetuity, then we are loosed. We loose the observances from the very specific circumstances of the Exodus, and we redefine those, the historical circumstances, as well as the observances, so that we become participants in them through the act of memory. So that's a great question. And again, I think the overemphasis on the perpetuity and on the propaedeutic has to do with exactly that need to sustain the obligation to observe in some way Pesach and Matzot, even after the moment of the Exodus. That's a great question. Thank you. Other questions or comments there, Moshe? Okay. So now we're going to go to the next step, which is step 3, which is why it has a Roman numeral 3, which is to look at the components that come in Exodus 12. This actually comes at the beginning of Exodus 12. That takes for granted the linkage of Pesach and Matzot. It's fascinating the way the text is put together with the combined festival presumed, then the separate blood smearing rite in verses 21 and following, and then that's followed in turn by the separate and special obligations for Matzot. But let's look at this beginning here. Excuse me, speak to the whole community of Israel. See, there's the narrative introduction that integrates the law into the story. We could have just had a halacha, right? We could have just, written in the book of Leviticus, every year on the 10th of the month of Aviv, or on the 10th of the month of Nisan, every family shall take a lamb. Okay, each of them a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. Now, if this obligation has anything realistic about it, it's clearly being addressed, assumes a culture of a pastoral culture, a culture of shepherds. Also, it's a lot of culling if every single family is obligated to have a single lamb. And it's also remarkable because it would involve an act of slaughter that is not based in the temple. It's not based in a temple or in a priestly ritual necessarily, certainly not at the outset when they're in Egypt. So the whole community of Israel, Kol Adat Yisrael, which is a term that's not used all that often, because usually, things are addressed to Moses and Aaron, and it's understood that they will transmit them. But here you have an absolute edict to transmit this to all of the people. And this business on the 10th of the month is so strange, so interesting. And I don't want to go into great detail about that, but that's the core whoops, I just did something, but I'm not sure what. What did I just do? Why am I? Do you still see my text?
Yes.
I don't see my text anymore. Okay, hang on a second. I'm going to stop sharing it. For some crazy reason, I lost my text on my screen. Oh, here it is. It's because I share. Okay, let's try this again. Something like this always has to happen. It's a rule of Zoom. Am I right, Moshe?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Well, you're on page 4.
Yeah, I'm cool. Sort of. I was teaching a class with about 600 people in it for JTS not long ago. And my computer just decided to update itself. And I couldn't stop it. I couldn't do anything about it. It just started to reboot. I started to get frantic cell phone calls. And ein ma la'asot, as we say in Hebrew. There's nothing I could do about it. So for some reason, the author here has decided to introduce a whole array of sub-instructions. And all of this obviously is intended to anticipate later observances that are associated with the occasion and embed them in the core narrative, that's say in the Exodus narrative. That's a way of emphasizing their importance and of pre-positioning them to the actual giving of the law. I hope you can see an analogy between there's only the one festival that's enjoined in the Ten Commandments. And of course, that's Shabbat. But a couple other things are worth noting. First of all, the motive for observing Shabbat in Exodus 20, is because God created the world and rested on the seventh day. But the motive for observing Shabbat in Deuteronomy chapter 5, when the Ten Commandments are restated, is because God took you out of the land of Egypt. And there's all kinds of explanations of why you have two different motives for Shabbat, but one obvious factor is that Shabbat is being assimilated to commemorate both of the core myths, the creation of the world and the exodus from Egypt. And you could say, for example, that nobody gets any rest if they're slaves. So the Shabbat is a gracious gift to a formerly enslaved people that makes sure that all of them have some opportunity to rest. But that's midrash, there's no actual clear explanation along those lines in Exodus. The other thing to keep in mind is that Shabbat is also pre-positioned to the giving of the Ten Commandments in the manna story in Exodus 17. Remember the story about how the Israelites get manna, and not only do they get a double portion on Friday, but they are enjoined absolutely not to go out and gather any manna on the seventh day, on Shabbat. So that's the biblical author's way of giving real primacy to these two sets of observances. One, the resting on Shabbat in Exodus 17, and the other, Pesach and Matsot, which we find here in Exodus 12 and 13. So it's not surprising that some of the subsidiary legislation is also added here. But if you simply go from here to here, on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. You wouldn't miss anything. That's because, in my view, this other material, the subsidiary material, has been secondarily embedded in the core observance in order to anticipate the actual observance that takes place in the land. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and lintel of the houses in which they're to eat it. They shall eat that flesh the same night. No mention of the destroyer. No mention of the Exodus. Because this is a core observance that takes the blood rite and disassociates it from the Exodus, or rather it represents a description of the blood rite that is independent of the Exodus and is purely the pastoral rite. Then come these other stipulations: roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Don't eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roasted. Does this necessarily have anything to do with the Exodus? Rhetorical question. Well, yes and no. In this context, where it's embedded in the Exodus narrative, yes. But in the abstract, it looks like instructions for consumption of a particular sacrifice in a particular manner at a particular time, which could be associated once again with the old pastoral rites rather than with the Exodus from Egypt. This is how you shall eat it. Boy, talk about a legislator with OCD. With your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. You have to eat it fast because it's a Passover offering to the Lord. And then finally, after all that, we get the motive, the explanation. I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn. Oh, first mention of the firstborn, first linkage of the third key element of Exodus 12 and 13 back to the narrative. So now we have a complete picture of what this text is trying to convey to us: the reinterpretation of the pastoral rite of the paschal lamb, the reinterpretation of the consumption of unleavened bread, which is supposed to keep death away from our homes, and the plague of the firstborn, which is actually a pretext for the dedication of first things to the sanctuary, whether they be firstlings, first sons, or first of the flock, or first of the harvest, whether it be from trees, which have to can't be deconsecrated for use until a gift has been brought to the sanctuary, or crops. So now we have the historical motive or etiology, narrative origin, which is this plague of the firstborn, which is probably the last thing that was added to the collection of plagues in the Exodus from Egypt, Exodus story, exactly to create this linkage between the story and the observance. I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt, which is interesting in itself. Ani Adonai, and that becomes important in the Seder, right, where God is not using an agent to do this, but is doing it God's self. And the blood on the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you, which is reiterated again when we come to the restatement of the ritual of the Paschal Lamb in verses 21 and following. Ufasachti aleichem, I will protect you. In other words, the divine halo of protection, as it were, guarantees that no plague will destroy them. Negev limashchit bahakoti be'eretz Mitzrayim. But here, the word mashchit refers to the destruction that God is going to wreak against the Egyptians. The mashchit in the earlier text, in Exodus 21 following, is an actual entity, an actual persona, not here. Here, the destruction is the phenomenon that's wrought by God. And again, remembrance, perpetuity, throughout all time. And now, within the self-same chapter, immediately following, 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. On the very first day, you shall remove leaven from your houses. Once again, see, there's nothing yet to indicate the first day as a festival that's coming. For kol ochel chametz v'nichotah nefesh ahi miYisrael. Anyone who eats leaven from the first to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Is that an extravagant threat? Well, yeah, in the abstract. But if this festival, if its observance is absolutely definitive of Jewish distinctiveness, of Jewish identity, of joining oneself to Jewish history as part of the Jewish people, then there's nothing extravagant about the penalty. It means that this is so core that failure to observe it is a basis, a sound one, for being cut off from Israel. Now we hear about a sacred occasion on the first day, which is the day when leaven is removed from the house, and a sacred occasion on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them. What does that tell you when it says, "Vayom hashvi'i mikra kodesh yiyeh lachem"? That's the assimilation by the later version of this halacha, the later version of the law, of Matsot to Sabbath. We didn't read in the earlier text in Exodus 13 that you're not allowed to work. You're just not allowed to eat leaven. Why is it that you're not allowed to work? Because all festivals become Sabbaths in the later version of the law. And that means that those festivals, especially the three pilgrimage festivals, so-called Pesach, Matsot, Shavuot, and Sukkot, are days when you're not allowed to work either. Not allowed to work. So that turns them de facto into Sabbaths when sacred convocations have to take place. Now that's a bit of a head scratcher. First, we're told in the earlier text that the lambs are family by family. Now we're being told that it's communal. That's because this reflects the later reinterpretation of the festivals as communal gathering times rather than as family feasts, which makes it kind of interesting that of all the festival observances, the one that we most closely associate with family gatherings is, of course, Pesach. Okay, now we're going to get a further motive. You observe Matsot, Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this day I brought you out of the land of Egypt, and then the commandment to observe it in perpetuity from the 14th day of the month until the 21st. You can't eat any unleavened bread. And the very specific numbering of the dates of the observance is another sign of relative lateness, relative to the way it was placed in Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 and following. And then the threat is reiterated. No leaven shall be found in your houses for 7 days. Whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel. It's almost as if that's the most important part of the observance. So the agricultural component the idea that what we're doing is engaging in an agrarian ritual that is designed by magic to help protect our crops and ensure a good yield has been utterly transformed into the historical commemoration that is, in its essence, definitive of Jewish identity, such that failure to observe it leads to one's being cut off from the community. Israel, bager uva. It's so important that even the sojourner, even the resident alien, someone who isn't fully obligated to observe all aspects of biblical or Jewish law, is subject to this stricture, lest any leaven, lest any signifier of death or rot or corruption be allowed for that 7-day period to enter into the community. Questions, comments? Moshe?
We're getting a ton there. Here we go. Okay, first question. Doesn't the Talmud say that more than one household could go in on the Paschal sacrifice?
Yeah, it's already in the Bible that sharing is permissible, but that represents a compromise with respect to the original edict. I mean, there are many everywhere. Biblical law always makes statements of principle that are followed by concessions to reality. I mean, that starts right away. Think about the law of murder, life for life. That means that you kill somebody, no matter for what reason, no matter how, right? No matter whether it's accidental or intentional, a life should be forfeit. But that's not reality. That's not what happens. There's immediately a series of qualifications and concessions follows. And the same thing is true here. There's a statement of the ideal, the principle, followed by concessions to reality. So your questioner is exactly right. And the rabbis, particularly in order to ensure that everybody is observant in some way or another, are particularly lenient with with regard to certain strictures in order to guarantee full observance, that everyone is able to do it. It's like, mailing your vote. If you can't get to the polling place, why shouldn't you be able to mail it? And you have to question the motives of somebody who said, well, that's not okay, because what they're clearly trying to do is prevent people from observing what's a fundamental obligation of citizenship. Well, it's the same here. I can't afford a lamb, so therefore I shouldn't have to observe the Pesa. No. There are a bunch of other ways to do it, both within the Bible and within rabbinic literature as well. It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, here's another one. Exactly what does being cut off from Israel mean?
That's a hard question, but I would just simply define it as being deprived of the rights to benefit from the participation in the sacrificial cults, participation in communal activities, and exclusion from the clan-based social safety net that is supposed to protect people should they have the misfortune to fall into a situation of poverty or illness, that they're persona non grata.
Okay, here's another one. Now the lines are really heating up. Aviva Zornberg writes that Pesach happened so we could tell the story. No matter the source, I think we get to interpret that story. The proof of that is in modern Haggadot. Keep going.
Didn't I sort? That's been one of my main points all along. I guess I haven't been clear enough on that. That much of the legislation is striving towards what I keep calling the propedeutic. That is to say, telling the story, teaching the observances, transmitting the value and significance from generation to generation. That's at the core of the biblical text, All the Haggadah does is concretize that. It just takes it to the next step. If you look at Exodus 18, where you may remember Moses comes back from Egypt, and out come his father-in-law, the pagan priest Jethro, and his wife Zipporah to greet him in the wilderness. And what does Moshe do? Moshe tells him the story of what happened, and Jethro is blown away. And they have what I sometimes facetiously refer to as the first Seder. They share a meal and they share the story. That's Moshe and his father-in-law. It's already embedded in the biblical narrative, but it's especially in the laws of propedeutic here. So, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with Aviva Zornberg, but if you think it's some big insight, then you just haven't read your Bible. It's clear that telling the story, teaching your children, is the very core of the legislation here. So don't be surprised that becomes the principal emphasis of the Haggadah, along with that other fundamental principle, which is Zachor, which is memory, but not just memory in the sense of remembering a dim historical event from the past, but actively engaging in it and identifying with it and empathizing with it and participating in it. As 10,000 rabbis and more have preached in their sermons, everyone's enslaved to something. Everyone requires liberation from something. And to cry out to God to bring that liberation, to bring that relief, and to offer thanks to God for having been available to provide that comfort is fundamental to Judaism, as it is to all the Western faiths. So thank you. You look like you're peering at your screen there, Moshe.
Yeah, and my wife tells me that I squint when I do that. Well, you know.
Squinting doesn't do me any good because I have plastic lenses.
Okay.
So that's one big difference between when you get your cataracts removed and you get your lenses implanted, is that you can't focus by squinting.
Okay, I didn't understand this question and I asked for it to be rewritten, but I'll give it to you anyway, okay? Is the original intent to have the holiday to be a communal feast each of the 7 days? I think that means does the whole community take part in the feast? Is that what that means?
No, the only part that is explicitly communal is the consumption of the sacrifice.
I see.
Right, but and we don't have any special observances ourselves, except on the first day, which becomes the first 2 days in diaspora, and on the 7th day, which becomes the 7th and 8th days in diaspora, because those are biblically legislated. But there's nothing sacrificial about Matsot. What there is the consumption of unleavened bread, because you're not allowed to have any leaven. It says right here in verse 20, which is on screen, Kol macheset lo tochelu v'chol moshevotechem tochelu matzot. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your settlements. You shall eat unleavened bread. So yeah, but I think your questioner rightly observes what is a fundamental tension in the text, which is, by the way, the same for Shabbat. Is it clan-based, or is it community-based, or is it both? And when we look at the way our observances have evolved, you can see that every one of our principal festivals is both. That is to say, it has a home component and it has a communal component. And that's because of the very complicated development of all of these festivals in from the biblical through the rabbinic periods. It's also obviously because of Galut, because of diaspora, which precludes the possibility of our assembling as a single Jewish people at a single shrine in Yerushalayim in order to engage in any of these rituals. Everything has to be transformed so that it can be based in local communities or based in our homes. Some combination of the two, generally speaking. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because it brings up one of the tensions that's even within Exodus 12 and 13. As you read through it, and you see it looks like some of this is based by families, and some of this is based by local communities, and then some of this seems to imply the whole community of Israel. And that's because the text is a composite of these different motives. That's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, here's one last one before.
Then I'll go to my conclusion. Okay.
Here's what specific aspect of Jewish identity is expected to be developed from the observation of the Passover event? Is there any specific aspect?
Well, I mean, basically, as we read in Leviticus 23, we never want to be enslaved to a human ruler, or one might say metaphorically, to human material passions. But we are obligated, because of the incredible debt we owe to God for liberating us from enslavement in Egypt, to serve God. So that because of this event, which freed us, it didn't just free our ancestors, it frees us. Frees us to what? Frees us to live our lives as Jews. So in other words, our core Jewish values should be embedded in us, not only because of our history, but because that history obligates us to carry on a certain set of values and practices that are set forth for us in Torah, and in Torah in the broadest sense of, Torah, Rabbinic Judaism, and Halacha, and our community values. I hope that's clear. So there's a fundamental sense of obligation that we should feel to God as God's servants, and specifically as Jews, because it was the Jewish people who were specifically liberated in order to undertake the yoke of the commandments and the laws immediately following the exodus from Egypt. That goes back to an earlier and very important question, which is to say that if you think God is only the liberator, who doesn't also impose obligation on us in the form of commandment and laws, then you've completely reinterpreted the story as it unfolds in the book of Exodus. And you can't be enslaved to anybody else because you're my servants. Read it in Leviticus chapter 23, where we're under an obligation, even though the laws in Exodus include laws about how you can hold a fellow Israelite in indentured servitude. By the time we get to this restatement of that law in Leviticus chapter 23, we're being told, you can't hold a fellow Israelite in servitude because we're only supposed to be in service to God, not to another human being, and certainly not to a character like Pharaoh, who thinks he's God and gets knocked down a notch or two by the real God in the story of the Exodus. So thank you for the question. Well, I already talked enough about the firstborn to not have to go into any great length about this, but I just want to reiterate the fact that the embedding of the dedication of firstborn, notice man and beast, we don't have the agricultural component introduced here because that comes later in the obligation to bring bikurim, which is not associated with Passover and Matsot, but which is associated with Shavuot, is here conjoined to the narrative, and it's it's restated here, and notice that it's restated in such a way that, again, responds to one of the other questions that we had before with concessions. So you're supposed to dedicate every firstborn. That means you know, every time you have a firstborn kid, you got to slaughter him, or you got to somehow dedicate him the way Hannah dedicates her son Samuel to the shrine in Shiloh to the priest Eli. But no. You have the option of pidyon for unclean animals and for children. So you can redeem an unclean animal so it doesn't fall under the sway of the sanctuary, which shouldn't have unclean things in it. And of course, you don't want to kill your kids. So sometimes you may feel like doing that, but probably either in ritual or other terms, you shouldn't. And then we're naturally going to get a propedeutic, because this is such a strange bit of legislation. It's just some primitive religious idea that things that are alive are sacralized because they have within them life, and therefore unfit for human use unless they are desacralized. Then they become quotidian, they become profane, and you can use them. So that's where all this firstborn stuff comes from, whether it be agricultural or whether it be the flocks, but no longer. Now it becomes linked when in time to come your son asks you saying, what does this mean? You shall say to him, I mean, talk about the Haggadah, you've got a script. The Bible gives you a script. So you don't have to think of any explanation yourself. You just go to the book. There it is. It was with a mighty hand that the Lord brought us out from Egypt, a house of bondage. That reminds you of the Ten Commandments. Hotzianu, Adonai, Mitzrayim, Beit Avadim. That's exactly mimicked in the language of the first commandments, or vice versa. When Pharaoh refused to let us go, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt. So who's the real God here? Pharaoh or Adonai? Well, I think this plague proves once and for all, absolutely definitively, that it's Adonai. Therefore, I sacrifice. Interesting. Ani zoveach. That's actually the term for ritual slaughter. L'Adonai kol peterechem hascharim b'chol b'chor banai efdeh. I sacrifice to the Lord every male issue of the womb. So it's a commemoration of the slaughter of the firstborn that allowed us to flee Egypt. We therefore eschew the use of first issues ourselves and dedicate them to God by way of commemoration. And then we get the story, Hi b'chatzi halayla, which we recite poems about that. And thus it continues. And we're back to the narrative now. Finally, just by way of a sort of a line-up at the end, I want to say another word about some of the motifs of the Exodus that come up in unlikely places. Again, we could do the whole 90 minutes just on this. So you may remember that there's a strange story in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, in which Saul, bereft of any prophetic insight, is desperately seeking some advice, and the only thing he can think to do is to go to a necromancer in order to ask her to raise up the spirit of his former mentor, the now deceased Shmuel. So King Saul wants to inquire of Samuel and asks this woman, who's very dubious about doing it, but seems to have the capability to do so, to bring up the ghost of Samuel. Whom shall I bring up for you? And he answered, bring up Samuel for me. Then the woman recognized Samuel, and she shrieked loudly and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You're Saul. Remember, Saul has imposed capital punishment for necromancy, but he's so desperate that he's willing to break his own law here in order to try to seek revelation from Samuel. So she says, the king answered her, don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said, Elohim ra'iti olim min haaretz. I see a divine being, that's Elohim, used as a god or gods with a small g, not as a title of God. God as an ancestral spirit, which occurs many times in the Bible, not as epithet of the Israelite God of Adonai, but as gods, either gods of other nations or gods as spirits of dead ancestors. What does he look like? Well, of course, he's going to look like an old man wrapped in a robe. What do you expect a dead corpse to look like when he comes up from the netherworld? He bows low and he prophesies disaster. But here's the part I want to get to. The woman went up to Saul, seeing how greatly disturbed he was. She said to him, I took my life in my hands and heeded the request you made of me. Now listen to me. Let me set before you a bit of food. Eat, and then you'll have the strength to go on. He said, I won't eat. But when his courtiers, as well as the woman, urged him, he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Laisha egel marbek. So she happened to have a calf available in the stall in the house. Vatimaher, she hastened. Vatizbachehu, and she slaughtered it. Vatikach kemach, she took flour. Vatalosh vatofehu matzot, and she kneaded the flour, and since it was urgent, the Torah Hasha'ah for the moment, she bakes it into matzah. She places it before Shaul and before his servants, and they ate, and they got up, and they left on that night. Sound familiar? I hope it does, because of all the Exodus motifs that are there. But what is this? This is a meal that commemorates an encounter with a dead, possibly deified ancestor. If, as I've argued a number of times, the Zachor commandment that we find repeatedly in the narrative of the Exodus of the Pesach and Matsot laws is also to try to induce us to engage in an act of identification with our ancestors, to become one with them, to sympathize with them, to become participants in the Exodus themselves, then it seems to me that it is not far-fetched to view, to some extent, Passover meal as a literal act of communion with the ancestors. And that some of the motifs that we associate with the meal in the Exodus story and our own preparations, taking the animal and slaughtering it, and then making matzot, because of the need to engage and depart in haste, that somehow, at least partly in the background of the Exodus meal, there is this meal of communion with the ancestors, which is exactly what we are undertaking as part of our Seder. So with that, I think our time is up. I'm still happy to take a question or two, even though it's past my bedtime. But I thought maybe that would just give you something a little perplexing to think about. Look up matzah, unleavened bread, in the concordance, and you'd be surprised to see other places where it's consumed, like the ugot matzot, like the that Lot prepares for the visitors who come to visit him in Genesis chapter 19. So thank you for both being patient with me and attentive, and for all the wonderful questions that you've asked. And thanks again for your kind invitation to learn with you this evening. And before I turn the floor back to Moshe, I want to wish you all a joyous and 100% kosher Pesach. We've already been to the shop, right? Because they got their Pesach stuff in, and it's already almost gone, as the Orthodox community of West Orange, New Jersey, sweep through it. So Moshe?
Okay. Alan, I'm so glad that you was able to accept our invitation. I think you've shown us what a real Bible scholar does and understands and makes connections out of a real wealth of knowledge. So on behalf of the committee and the attendees, I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank the attendees themselves. There were some great questions here, and they spurred ongoing conversation. And for that, on behalf of the committee, I thank them and I thank you. And I want everybody to be well and be safe.